Caleb Boone hadn't cried at his wife's grave. He just turned around, walked back to an empty ranch, and locked the door on everything that used to matter. For 11 months, no fire, no food, no reason. Then one summer evening, smoke curled out of a chimney that was supposed to be cold forever. And the smell that hit him wasn't ash, it was bread. Warm, golden, impossible bread. He reached for his rifle before he even realized he was moving. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's find out together how far this story can travel. The rifle was in his hands before his brain caught up with his hands. Caleb Boone stood dead still at the bend in the dirt road, 50 yards from his own front porch, and stared at the chimney like it had personally insulted him. Smoke was rising out of it, lazy and slow, curling up into the hot summer evening, like it belonged there, like it had every right in the world to be there. It didn't. He hadn't lit that fire in 11 months. Not since Clara. His jaw locked. His thumb found the hammer on the rifle without thinking, muscle memory from years in the mountain country where hesitation got men killed. He moved off the road and into the dry grass, cutting wide around the front of the house, keeping low, keeping quiet. The summer air was brutal, hot enough to press down on a man's shoulders like a physical weight. The kind of July heat that made the mountains shimmer at the edges and turned the creek beds to dust by noon. Caleb barely noticed it. He'd been riding 6 hours, and he was tired down to his teeth, but the smoke had burned that away clean. He came around the east side of the house and stopped. Light. Warm golden light spilling out of the kitchen window. And then the smell hit him. Bread. Real bread, the kind that fills a whole room. And underneath it something slower. Something rich. A stew. Meat and onion, and something he couldn't quite name, but that his stomach recognized before his mind did. Caleb hadn't eaten anything cooked by human hands since February. He didn't soften. He tightened. Because whoever was inside that house wasn't afraid. Afraid people kept quiet. Afraid people kept dark. Whoever had walked into his home and lit his stove and cooked his food, they expected to still be standing there when he walked through the door. He came around to the front porch, stepped up slow, and put his back to the wall beside the door. He listened. Movement inside. Easy movement. Unhurried. The sound of a ladle against iron. A soft sound, not quite humming, not quite singing. Something in between. Caleb kicked the door open. He came in fast and low, rifle up, finger outside the trigger guard. He wasn't a murderer, but everything else about him said, "Don't move." The woman at the stove didn't scream. She turned around. Slow. Deliberate. Like she'd been expecting him. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark auburn hair pinned back off her neck because of the heat. Her dress was plain and trail-worn, the hem caked with red dust. She had a ladle in one hand, and she did not drop it. Her eyes went to the rifle, then to his face, then back to the rifle. She said, "You're going to want to point that somewhere else." Caleb said, "I'm going to want to know who you are and why you're in my house." Both reasonable things. She set the ladle down on the edge of the pot. "My name is Eliza Rowan. I've been riding for 4 days. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back, and your barn has the only dry straw I've seen since the Bitterroot Valley." She paused. "Your door wasn't locked." "It should have been." "It wasn't." She held his gaze. "And I was hungry, and so I cooked. The flour in your pantry was still good. Barely." "That flour isn't yours." "No," she said simply. "It's not. Neither is the stove or the house or the firewood I used. I'm aware." She looked at him without flinching. "You can throw me out. That's your right. But I figured either you'd let me stay or you'd throw me out. Either way, you'd come home to something warm." Caleb stared at her. He was a man who had spent the last 11 months in silence, and he had gotten very good at reading people by their stillness, by the way they breathed, by the small things they did with their hands when they thought no one was watching. He looked at Eliza Rowan's hands. They were steady. They were the hands of a woman who had been through something that broke lesser people and had decided not to break. He lowered the rifle. Not all the way. Just enough to not be rude. "There's a room at the back of the barn," he said. "I'll get your horse fixed up in the morning." She nodded once. "I appreciate that. Don't cook anything else." She looked at the pot on the stove, then back at him. "It's already done." "Then don't do it again." She didn't answer, which wasn't the same as agreeing. He noticed that too. He pulled a chair out from the kitchen table, sat down, set the rifle against the wall, where he could reach it, and said, "Sit down and eat, then get out to the barn." She sat down across from him and served the stew without being asked, and didn't say a single word that wasn't necessary. They ate in silence. It was the best meal Caleb had eaten in almost a year. He hated how much that mattered. He gave her the back room in the barn, and he went inside, and he lay down on his bed with his boots still on, and stared at the ceiling. Clara had died in June. Last June. Fever came fast, and the doctor in Millhaven was 3 hours away, and by the time Caleb got back with him, she was already gone. She was 26 years old, and she had been laughing at breakfast and dead before supper, and there wasn't a single thing in the world he'd been able to do to stop it. He'd kept the ranch running because that was what a man did. He got up, and he fed the cattle, and he mended the fences, and he rode the mountain line in the spring when the strays went up into the timber, and he did all of it without making a sound about what it cost him. He didn't allow himself to look at her things. He didn't allow himself to cook her recipes. He didn't allow himself to sit at that kitchen table after dark. And now, there was a woman in his barn who had walked into his house and cooked a meal without permission and sat across from him without apology. And something about that, something about the sheer nerve of it, had knocked a crack in the wall he'd built so carefully. He didn't like it. He closed his eyes and told himself he'd be rid of her by noon tomorrow. At first light, he was in the barn. The horse's thrown shoe was on the left front, easy enough to fix if he had the stock, which he did. He set to work in the early morning quiet, the heat already building even before the sun cleared the mountains. The light came in gray and gold through the gaps in the barn boards. He heard her behind him. "You didn't have to do that this early," Eliza said. "I wake up early." "So do I." She moved around him to the horse's head, laid a hand on the animal's neck, speaking low. The horse, a dark bay mare, travel-worn and favoring that left leg, settled under her touch immediately. "She's called Juniper. Good horse. The best I've ever had." She looked at him over the mare's neck. "Where did you learn to shoe?" "My father." "Good man?" "Decent." He set the nail and drove it home. "You riding south or north?" A pause. "I haven't decided yet." Caleb looked up at that. She was watching him with those steady dark eyes, and there was something behind them he couldn't read, something careful and contained. "That's an odd thing," he said. "Is it? Most people riding through the mountains in July have somewhere to be." "Most people." She stroked the mare's nose. "I had somewhere to be 6 months ago. Things changed." He waited. Waited to see if she'd fill the silence. That was usually how you learned the important things about a person, what they said, when no one asked them to say anything. She said, "My father's ranch is in the valley below Crabtree Pass." Or it was. Her voice stayed even. "Victor Hale took it. Filed papers in the county seat back in March. My father didn't even know it was coming until the sheriff showed up to tell him the land belonged to the Hale Land Company as of the 15th. Caleb stopped working. He set down the hammer. "Hale," he said. "Victor Hale. You know him?" "I know the name." "Mo." He picked up the hammer again. "Everybody in 2 counties knows the name." "Then you know what he does." Caleb said nothing. He knew exactly what Victor Hale did. The man was a land lawyer out of the territorial capital, and what he specialized in was finding old debt claims, old liens, old paperwork, with signatures that could be argued over, and burying ranchers under legal weight until they couldn't fight anymore. He didn't use guns. He didn't have to. He had a team of lawyers and a judge in his pocket, and a filing clerk who knew how to make documents say whatever Victor Hale needed them to say. 3 ranchers in the Northern Valley had lost their spreads in the last 2 years. Nobody had been able to prove anything. "Where's your father now?" Caleb asked. "Staying with my uncle in Millhaven. He's not well." Her voice changed slightly on those words, just slightly. "He's 63 years old, and he built that land from nothing, and when they told him it wasn't his anymore, something in him just—" She stopped, started again. "He's not the man he was." Caleb finished the shoe and stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at her. She was looking at the mare, not at him. Her jaw was set in a way he recognized the way a person's jaw set when they'd already cried everything they had, and now there was just the hard, dry thing left underneath. "What are you planning to do about it?" he said. "Find the proof." She looked at him then, direct. "I know what he does with the paperwork. I know because my father was a county recorder before he bought the land. I grew up watching how documents are filed, how they're indexed, what a fraudulent seal looks like against a real one." She paused. "Victor Hale has been using a dead man's official seal. Albert Drury, former notary in Crabtree County. Drury died in January of 1877. Hale's been stamping documents with that seal since March of 1878. Caleb stared at her. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. You have evidence of this." "Not yet." Her chin came up just slightly. "That's what I'm writing to get." He leaned against the barn post and studied her for a long moment. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She just met his gaze and waited. "Eliza Rowan," he said. "Yes." "Why'd you stop here?" "There's 3 other ranches between Crabtree Pass and my spread. The other 3 ranches have already sold to Hale." She said it simply, like it was just a fact. "I checked before I rode through." He felt something shift in his chest, cold and heavy. "He's buying up this side of the mountain," Caleb said. "He's not buying," she said. "He's taking. There's a difference." The heat of the morning pressed down hard on the barn roof, and somewhere outside a meadowlark was calling, and Caleb Boone stood in the half-dark of his barn and understood for the first time since he'd walked home to find smoke in his chimney that this woman arriving on his land was not an accident. It wasn't fate either. He didn't believe in fate. It was a problem walking into the middle of another problem, and the only question was what a man did when that happened. "You can stay in the back room for now," he said. "The ranch house guest room is—" He stopped himself. "The guest room's usable. The barn's no place to sleep in this heat." She looked at him. Something passed across her face. Not softness exactly. Something more careful than that. "I don't want to impose," she said. "You already cooked in my kitchen," he said. "You've moved past imposing." The corner of her mouth did something. Almost a smile. Gone before it fully arrived. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I might still throw you out." "Fair enough," she said. He didn't throw her out. 3 days passed, then a week. She worked. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated. He'd expected a woman in trouble to sit and wait and let him figure it out. Instead, Eliza Rowan woke before sunrise and went to work like the ranch was already hers, patching the south fence line where the summer drought had warped the posts hauling water for the cattle with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, fixing the rusted pump handle that Caleb had been meaning to get to since April. She didn't ask permission. She just saw what needed doing and did it. He watched her work one afternoon from the ridge above the lower pasture, and he felt something he didn't want to feel. It wasn't attraction, or not only that. It was recognition. She moved like someone who understood what it meant to hold a thing together through sheer will. He'd been doing that for 11 months. He recognized it in her bones. In the evenings, she spread her papers across the kitchen table. Maps she had. County records she'd copied out by hand before Hale's men had cleared out the recorder's office. Dates, names, property descriptions going back to the first territorial surveys. Caleb started sitting across from her. At first he told himself it was just the table, his right to sit there. But she'd start explaining something, and he'd find himself leaning forward following the thread, because the picture she was building was both meticulous and terrifying. Victor Hale wasn't just taking one ranch. He was building something. A land corridor running from the territorial railroad spur in the south all the way up through the mountain passes. Land that once consolidated would be worth 10 times what it cost to steal it. "The railroad," Caleb said one night. "The railroad," she confirmed. She put her finger on the map. "The new spur goes through here. Anyone who owns this stretch of mountain country will collect right-of-way fees for the next 50 years. She looked up at him. "That's why the timeline is now. The railroad files its final survey in October." "How many ranchers has he already taken?" She counted. 8. 8 families. In 2 years. "And nobody's gone to the federal marshal," Caleb said. "2 people tried." Her voice went quiet. "One dropped the complaint. The other one's barn burned down in the night." She looked at him. There were horses inside. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb said, "The marshal know about the barn." "The marshal is the one who told the man he should drop the complaint." He sat back, rubbed one hand across his jaw. The evening light was long and gold, and somewhere outside, the cattle were moving slow toward the lower pasture for the night, and Caleb thought about a man named Victor Hale, who wore a good suit and spoke like a gentleman, and destroyed lives with paperwork, and never raised his voice once. He thought about Clara, who had never had anything to do with any of it, and still wasn't here. He thought about 8 families. "My spread is next," he said. It wasn't a question. Eliza didn't soften it. "Most likely, yes. The timing fits. He'll want the upper mountain access before he moves on anyone in the valley. And you need a base to work from. I need someone who knows this mountain country." She held his gaze. "I need someone Hale won't see coming. He expects ranchers to fight him at the county seat with bad lawyers and borrowed money. He doesn't expect—" She paused, chose her words. "He doesn't expect a mountain man who knows every trail on this slope." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me first?" She was quiet too for just a moment, like she hadn't quite expected the question to come that easily. "There's a man in Millhaven," she said, "a clerk named Josiah Pell. He worked in the county recorder's office for 15 years. He knows where the original survey documents are stored. The real ones, not Hale's copies." She spread her hands on the map. "If we can get Pell to testify, if we can get the originals into federal court, the whole thing unravels. Every claim, every deed, every forged seal." "Why hasn't Pell come forward already?" Her eyes dropped to the table, just for a moment. "Because Victor Hale knows about Pell's son. The boy owes a gambling debt to one of Hale's associates. Hale has been sitting on that debt for 2 years, keeping Pell quiet." "What happens if we settle the debt?" She looked up. "The debt is $400. Caleb said nothing. $400 was a significant sum for a man running a mountain ranch in a drought year. She was watching him, not asking, not pushing, just watching. "All right," he said. She blinked. "You don't have to." "I know what I have to do and what I choose to do," he said. "They're not always the same." He stood up from the table. "I'll ride to Millhaven day after tomorrow. I need to check the north pasture fence tomorrow morning." He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "Go to sleep, Miss Rowan. It's late." "Eliza," she said. He paused at the door. "People who are planning something this dangerous together," she said, "probably ought to use first names." He put his hat on. "Good night, Eliza," he said. He went out into the summer night, and the stars were burning hard and white above the mountains, and the heat of the day still sat in the dirt under his boots, and Caleb Boone stood on his own porch for the first time in 11 months and did not feel the weight of the empty house behind him. He felt something else, something he hadn't had since June of last year. Purpose. He almost didn't ride to Millhaven, not because he changed his mind, because on the morning of the second day when he came in from the north pasture just before noon, there was a man sitting on a horse in the middle of his yard, well-dressed, dark coat despite the summer heat, hat straight on his head, horse that cost more than most men made in a year. Victor Hale. He was smiling. Caleb came across the yard slow and stopped a fair distance away and didn't say anything because men like Victor Hale always talked first. They loved to hear themselves. "Mr. Boone," Hale said. His voice was even and pleasant. He had the kind of voice that belonged in a bank. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. My name is Victor Hale. I represent the Hale Land Company, which has recently acquired properties in this area." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding land. "I wanted to come personally as a courtesy." "A courtesy," Caleb said, "to let you know that we've identified a potential claim issue with your property deed. Nothing that can't be resolved, of course. These things happen with older land grants." Hale's smile didn't move. "I'd hate for you to have any unnecessary difficulty. Our company is prepared to offer a fair price, quite fair, Mr. Boone, for a clean and uncomplicated transfer." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. He heard the kitchen door open behind him. He heard Eliza step out onto the porch. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on Victor Hale. Hale's eyes went to Eliza. Just for a fraction of a second. Something passed across his face, too controlled to read, too fast to catch, and then he was smiling again at Caleb. "I'd recommend giving it some consideration," Hale said. "The summer's been hard on ranchers this year. I understand there are difficulties." He gathered his reins. "I'll leave my card with your—" He glanced at Eliza again. "Associate." He turned his horse and rode out of the yard without hurrying. Caleb stood and watched him go. Behind him, Eliza said quietly, "He knows I'm here." "Yes," Caleb said. "That changes things." "Yes," he said again. He turned around. She was standing at the edge of the porch, and her face was the color of old ash. Not fear, he'd established. She wasn't easy to frighten, but something colder than fear, the look of someone doing fast math about a bad situation. "He came here himself," she said. "He didn't send a man, he came himself." "What does that mean?" Her jaw tightened. "It means he's not worried about us." Her eyes met his. "It means he's already done something, filed something, and he came here to let you know it's already too late." Caleb looked at the dust settling where Victor Hale's horse had been. Then he turned back to her. "Get your papers," he said. "All of them. We're riding to Millhaven today." She held his gaze for just a moment. Then she went inside without a word, and Caleb walked to the barn to saddle 2 horses, and the summer heat beat down on the dry Montana earth, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled slow and patient above the mountain. He didn't look up at it. He had work to do. They rode hard and they rode fast, and Caleb didn't speak for the first hour out of the ranch because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said louder. Eliza kept pace beside him without complaint. She rode like a woman who'd grown up in the saddle, weight forward, hands easy on the reins, Juniper's newly shod hoof striking the dirt road with a clean, solid sound. She had her saddlebag stuffed full of papers, the leather bulging at the seams. She'd grabbed everything off the kitchen table in under 3 minutes. He'd clocked it. The mountain trail to Millhaven cut down through pine timber and then opened onto the flat valley road, and by the time the tree line broke, the sun was already past midday and hammering down without mercy. Caleb pulled his hat lower and said nothing, and Eliza pulled hers lower and said nothing, and they rode like 2 people who understood that silence could be a form of preparation. It was Eliza who broke it first. "He knew my name," she said. Caleb looked over at her. "What?" When he looked at me, on the porch. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. He didn't ask who I was. He already knew. Her jaw tightened. He's had someone watching the road, probably since before I even arrived at your place. Caleb let that sit for a moment. How long ago did you leave Crabtree Pass? 8 days. He had someone on the trail 8 days ago. He had someone on the trail the moment my father's land was filed, she said. Victor Hale doesn't leave loose ends. My father tried to fight it. That made me a loose end. She looked at Caleb, then straight and level. And now you're one too. He didn't answer that, because there wasn't anything useful to say about it, and Caleb Boone had never been a man who talked just to fill quiet. He pressed his heels to his horse, and they picked up the pace, and the valley spread out ahead of them dry and gold under the summer sky. Millhaven came into view an hour before sunset. It wasn't much of a town. A main street with a general store, a feed lot, a land office that had been built 2 years ago and was newer and better kept than anything else on the block. A saloon at the far end. A church at the near end which Caleb had always found telling about the order a town put things in. The hotel sat in the middle 2 stories, paint peeling at the eaves. They came in from the north road, and Caleb felt the town before he saw the faces in it. That particular weight of people watching, without wanting to look like they were watching. 2 men outside the feedlot. A woman sweeping a porch who stopped sweeping. A boy who ran back inside his house so fast the screen door didn't even have time to bang shut behind him. This town's afraid, Eliza said quietly. This town's owned, Caleb said. He tied both horses in front of the hotel, and they went inside, and he paid for 2 rooms with what he had in his coat pocket without looking at the total, because now wasn't the time to think about money. The clerk behind the desk was a thin young man with nervous eyes, and he looked at Eliza's saddlebag stuffed with papers and looked away very quickly, like he'd seen something he didn't want to have seen. Caleb noticed. In the narrow hallway upstairs, he stopped and said to Eliza, "That clerk's going to tell someone we're here inside of an hour." "I know." She said it without surprise. "Then we have an hour." Josiah Pell. Where does he live? 3 blocks east of the main street. White house with a green door. His wife plants flowers out front. She paused. Or she used to. Caleb said, "You go. I'll wait here." She looked at him sharply. "Caleb, if both of us show up at his door, he'll panic. One person is easier to manage." He met her eyes. "You know him. I don't. You go." She held his gaze for a moment, reading something in his face. Then she nodded once and turned for the stairs. "Eliza." She stopped. He said, "Don't tell him everything. Not yet. Just tell him enough to get him to agree to talk more." She looked back over her shoulder. "I know how to talk to frightened people, Caleb." He believed her. She left, and Caleb went to his room and sat in the chair by the window where he could see the street below, and he watched. He'd learned to watch in the mountains, not moving, not attracting attention, just reading the small shifts in how things moved. Within 20 minutes, he saw the clerk from the front desk come out the side door of the hotel and walk quickly up the main street and go into the land office. 20 minutes. That was fast, even by his estimate. Which meant the land office was either expecting news or had told the clerk to move immediately if anything came in worth reporting. Caleb stood up. He went back downstairs, out the front door around to the side alley, where he'd loosened his horse's cinch, but kept her tied short, and he retightened it in case they needed to move quickly. Then he went to the saloon, found a table in the back corner, where he could see both doors, and ordered a coffee he didn't drink. He sat, and he thought about what Eliza had said about Victor Hale, that he was already 2 moves ahead, that the filing had probably already been done, that coming here personally was a message, not a negotiation. Caleb thought about the 8 families, the barn that had burned with horses inside. He thought about Clara, which he tried not to do, but the truth was that everything about this situation kept pulling him back to her. She would have known what to do. Clara had been the sharpest mind he'd ever known in a small woman's body, and she would have sat down at that table with Eliza's papers and mapped the whole thing out in half the time it had taken both of them. She would have laughed at Victor Hale, not out of foolishness, out of the pure confidence of someone who had never been intimidated by men who used money the way other men used guns. He was still thinking about her when the saloon door opened and a man he didn't know sat down across from him without being invited. The man was big, not fat-wide, shoulders that had spent real years doing real work and hands that matched. He wore a deputy's star on his chest that looked too new and too bright. "You'd be Caleb Boone," the deputy said. "I would," Caleb said. "Sheriff Ames wants a word." Caleb picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "The sheriff can come here." The deputy's face shifted slightly. He hadn't expected that. "Mr. Boone, I'm not under arrest, am I?" "No, sir." "Then the sheriff can come here." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I'm not hard to find." The deputy sat there for a moment, with the particular look of a man deciding whether to make something bigger than it needed to be. Then he stood up and walked back out the door, and Caleb set his elbows on the table and waited, because this was exactly the kind of thing he'd expected, and a man who was surprised by the expected things wasn't paying close enough attention. The sheriff came 8 minutes later. He was older than Caleb expected. 50s, gray at the temples, with the slow and careful way of moving that either meant wisdom or exhaustion, and in this town was probably both. He sat down across from Caleb without introducing himself, because he clearly assumed he didn't need to. "Mr. Boone," he said. "Sheriff, you're a long way from your spread." "I had business in town." "What kind of business?" Caleb looked at him for a moment. The sheriff's eyes were steady, but there was something behind them, not cruelty, not the cold blankness of a bought man. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked, if Caleb was reading it right, uncomfortably close to shame. "The legal kind," Caleb said. The sheriff folded his hands on the table. "I'm going to be straight with you, Mr. Boone, because I believe in being straight. You rode into town with Eliza Rowan. I know who she is. I know whose daughter she is. And I know what she's been trying to do for the last 6 months." He kept his eyes on Caleb. "It won't work." "Why not?" "Because the county's already decided. The filings are legal. The court in the territorial capital has reviewed them twice." He said it like a man reading from something he'd memorized but didn't believe anymore. "There's nothing here to find." Caleb said, "You know about Albert Drury's seal?" The sheriff went very still. It was the stillness of a man who hadn't expected to hear a specific thing and was now recalculating everything. His hands folded on the table, pressed flat. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "Yes, you do," Caleb said. "Not aggressive, just level. And you know what it means if it gets in front of a federal judge instead of a territorial one." Silence. The saloon moved around them, 2 men at the barkeep polishing glasses, nobody paying attention to the corner table, because nobody wanted to be seen paying attention. The sheriff said very quietly, "Son, you are poking at something that has already swallowed bigger men than you." "I know it," Caleb said. "I'm not a big man. I'm just a rancher who doesn't want to lose his land." He leaned forward slightly. "And I reckon there are about 8 other families in this valley who feel the same way." The sheriff stood up. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was tired and complicated and said too many things at once. "Get out of Millhaven by morning," he said. "Both of you." He walked out. Caleb sat very still for a moment. Then he dropped a coin on the table for the coffee he hadn't drunk, and walked out of the saloon and went back toward the hotel, moving at a pace that was quick without being urgent, because a running man attracted attention, and a strolling man attracted none. He was halfway down the alley beside the hotel when Eliza appeared at the far end, coming fast from the east, and even at that distance, he could read something in the way she was moving, tight controlled, barely contained. They met in the middle of the alley, and she grabbed his arm with one hand and said in a low, rapid voice, "Pell will talk." "Good." But not here. Not in Millhaven. She was breathing harder than the walk accounted for. He's terrified. He shook the whole time I was talking to him. Caleb. He knows more than I thought. A lot more. He says there are documents, original survey records, that were supposed to be transferred to the Territorial Archive that never arrived. He knows where Hale's men put them. Caleb looked at her. Where? A property Hale controls south of Crabtree Pass. Old mining claim. There's a structure on it. Her grip on his arm tightened. But that's not the worst part. She looked up at him, and her eyes were very dark and very serious. Pell says Hale has a contact in the federal marshal's office, not just the local sheriff. Federal. She let that land. Which means going to the marshal doesn't work. Going to the territorial court doesn't work. It has to go directly to the federal circuit judge. Bypass everything in between. Caleb thought fast. How do we get to a circuit judge without going through the marshal's office? Pell knows a lawyer in Helena, a man named Aldridge. Federal bar no connection to Hale's network, and he has a prior case against one of Hale's associates from 3 years ago. She finally released his arm. But Aldridge needs documentation, real documentation. Not copies, not hand-recorded notes, the original surveys. Which are at the mining claim south of Crabtree Pass. Yes. Caleb looked at the far end of the alley, where the main street moved in the long light of late afternoon. The clerk from the hotel went to the land office 20 minutes after we arrived, he said. I know, I saw him go. We need to leave tonight, not morning. Pell needs tonight to get his records together. He has duplicates. He kept copies of everything for 15 years, hiding them because he knew someday they'd matter. He'll meet us at the North Trailhead at first light. She met his eyes. Can we stay hidden until then? Caleb considered the hotel room, the nervous clerk, the sheriff, with his flat hands and his shame. Not in the hotel, he said. No. He thought about the town, about what he'd seen when they rode in. The church, he said. North end of the main street. Whoever keeps that church isn't part of what's happening here. A man who runs an honest church in a corrupt town is either brave or too stubborn to bend. Either kind will help if you ask right. Eliza looked at him. How do you know that? I don't, he said. But I know which way the church faces, and it's away from the land office, which means whoever built it wasn't trying to be close to power. He picked up the reins. Go get your bag from the room. Come down the back stairs. I'll meet you at the far end of this alley in 10 minutes. She was gone before he finished the sentence. He went and got his own bag and his rifle and came back to the alley, and exactly 9 minutes later, she appeared at the other end with her saddlebag over her shoulder. Papers still inside, and they walked the horses around the back of the buildings without touching the main street. Keeping to the gaps between structures, moving with the particular unhurried purpose of people who belonged anywhere and nowhere at once. The church had one light burning inside. Caleb knocked on the side door, and a tall man with a preacher's collar and a carpenter's hands opened it after a moment and looked at them without saying anything. Caleb said, We need a quiet place until first light. We're not criminals. We're in a bad situation, and I won't lie to you about it. The preacher looked at him, then at Eliza, then at her overstuffed saddlebag. I know Eliza Rowan, the preacher said, which surprised them both. I know her father. Thomas Rowan was an honest man, and what happened to his land was a sin, whatever the county court says about it. He stepped back from the door. Come inside. They settled in the back room of the church, a plain space with 2 cots used for traveling circuit preachers, and Eliza spread her papers on the floor in the low lamplight, and Caleb sat against the wall and watched the door and listened to the town settle into night around them. After a while, she said without looking up, You told the sheriff about Drury's seal. Yes. You weren't supposed to know about that, not officially. She looked up now. If Hale hears that you specifically named it, he's already coming for my land, Caleb said. The seal is leverage. I needed to know if the sheriff knew. He paused. He knew. And And he told me to leave town by morning, which means he's scared. Which means the seal matters as much as you said it does." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, something more specific than either. "You're good at this," she said. "I'm good at reading people," he said. "Mountains teach you that. Silence teaches you that." She turned back to her papers. "You've been silent a long time." It wasn't quite a question. He answered it anyway. "My wife died last June," he said. She went still, didn't look up, didn't offer condolences, which he appreciated because condolences always felt like they were for the person giving them, not the person receiving. "I'm sorry," she said simply and cleanly, like she meant it and nothing more. She would have had this whole thing figured out in 2 days, he said. He didn't know why he said it. It was just true, and it seemed like the right place to put it. "She was smarter than me about people." "You seem to be doing all right," Eliza said quietly. He looked at the lamp throwing light across her papers, and her hands, and the careful lines of her handwriting that covered every margin, and he thought about how the kitchen had smelled the first night, and how the ranch had felt different with another person moving through it, and how wrong and how right both of those things were at the same exact time. He looked away. "Get some sleep," he said. "We need to be at that trailhead before Pell loses his nerve." She gathered her papers and lay down on the cot without argument and was quiet, and Caleb sat against the wall with his rifle across his knees and watched the door, and did not sleep because something in the night outside this church had already shifted, and he could feel it the way a mountain man feels weather coming. Not seeing it yet, but knowing it was there, building just over the ridge, moving toward them fast. By the time the sky went from black to the particular deep blue that came just before dawn, he was already tightening cinches and checking loads and watching the road. Josiah Pell was supposed to be at the north trailhead at first light. First light came. Pell wasn't there. Caleb and Eliza waited in the tree line without speaking, and the minutes stretched long and tight, and the sky kept lightening, and every sound on the trail below had Caleb's hand moving toward his rifle before he'd made a conscious decision about it. 15 minutes past first light. 20. Eliza said very quietly, "Something's wrong." "Yes," Caleb said. And then they heard hoofbeats on the lower trail. Fast ones. Too fast for a frightened old clerk, meeting people carefully in the early morning. The sound of someone being chased, or someone carrying news so bad they'd stopped caring about being careful. A horse broke into the tree line below them, and the rider was not Josiah Pell. It was a boy, 14, maybe 15, with Pell's wide forehead and his same nervous eyes, and he hauled the horse up hard when he saw them and nearly came off the saddle with the effort. "My grandfather sent me," the boy said, chest heaving. "He can't come. They came to the house last night, 2 men. They said if he talks to anyone about anything, my father's debt gets called in by end of week." He swallowed hard. "My grandfather says he's sorry. He says he can't." Eliza closed her eyes for just a moment. 1 moment, then she opened them. "Did he give you anything?" she asked. "Anything at all." The boy reached inside his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out, and his hand was shaking. Eliza took it, unfolded it, read it. And then she looked at Caleb, and her face had changed in a way that made his chest go tight before she even opened her mouth. "It's an address," she said. "In Helena." She looked up. "He wrote Aldridge's address down and told us to go ourselves." Her voice was careful and controlled, and underneath it something was pulling hard. "He says—" She stopped, started again. "He says the documents at the mining claim. He knows where they're stored exactly. He drew a diagram." She turned the paper so Caleb could see the small, cramped sketch at the bottom. "He's giving us everything he can without speaking a word in front of anyone." Caleb looked at the diagram, looked at the boy still sitting, his horse still shaking. He looked at Eliza. "We have to go to the mining claim," she said. "I know," he said. It's on Hale's property. I know that too. She held his gaze. Caleb, if we're found on Hale's property, I know what happens. He took the paper from her and folded it and put it inside his coat. Then he looked at the boy. Go home. Don't tell anyone you talk to us. Tell your grandfather we got the message and we're grateful. He hesitated. Tell him we're going to finish it. The boy looked at him for a moment with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone trying to decide whether to believe a thing. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the trail fast, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the trees, and the morning came up clear and brutal and hot around them. And Eliza Rowan stood in the mountain timber with the whole weight of 8 families and one old man's courage and her father's broken life in her hands, and she did not look away from any of it. South of Crabtree Pass, she said. How far? Half a day's ride. She looked at him, straight into the heart of his territory. Caleb checked his rifle, checked his revolver, settled his hat on his head, and put his foot in the stirrup. Then we'd better ride, he said. And they did. The ride south of Crabtree Pass was the kind of quiet that had teeth in it. Caleb kept them off the main trail, cutting through timber and dry creek beds, where the ground was too hard to hold tracks worth reading. Eliza didn't question his route. She watched the tree line and kept her horse close and said nothing, and he appreciated that more than he could have explained. Most people filled nervous silence with words. She understood that silence was a tool. They rode for 3 hours before he pulled up and listened. Nothing behind them, nothing ahead. Just the dry summer wind, moving through the pines, and the distant complaint of a jay somewhere to the west. How much farther? He said. Eliza pulled out Pell's folded paper. She'd already memorized it, but she looked at it again anyway, the habit of a careful person making sure. Another hour, maybe less. There's a creek crossing before the property line. Old mining road runs east from there. Guarded. Pell didn't say. Which means he doesn't know. Which means we assume yes. Caleb looked at the angle of the sun. We leave the horses in the timber 200 yards back from the structure. We go on foot. She folded the paper and tucked it away. And if someone's inside, then we wait them out. And if we can't, he looked at her. One problem at a time, Eliza. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, and they rode on. The mining claim came up on them slower than the distance suggested it should. That was the particular trick of mountain terrain in summer. The heat made everything shimmer at the edges and distances lied. But Caleb had been riding this country since he was 19 years old, and he read the land under his horse's feet the way other men read newspapers. And when the old mining road appeared through the trees exactly where Pell's diagram said it would be, something settled in his chest. Pell had been telling the truth, which meant the rest of it was probably true too. They tied the horses deep in a stand of pine and moved forward on foot. And Caleb went first with his hand on his revolver and his eyes moving constantly, reading every shadow and every shift in the brush ahead. The structure Pell had drawn was a long, low building, the kind of thing a mining operation built for tool storage, not comfort. The door faced east. One window on the south wall. No horses outside. No smoke. No sound. Caleb held up one fist and Eliza stopped behind him without making a sound. He waited a full minute, counting his own heartbeats, watching the door, watching the window, watching the ground around the building for the small, crushed patterns that meant recent foot traffic. Nothing moved. Clear, he said quietly. They crossed the open ground fast, Caleb going to the door and Eliza going to the window, and she pressed her back to the wall and looked and shook her head once. Empty. He tried the door. Locked, but a padlock, not a bolt, and a padlock on a mining shed meant it was keeping honest people out, not determined ones. He pulled his belt knife and worked the hasp screws out of the wood frame in under 2 minutes, the old pine giving them up almost willingly, and the door swung open. The smell hit them first. Paper. Old paper and something chemical. The particular smell of official documents stored in heat. And there, stacked in wooden crates along the back wall, were the files. Eliza made a sound he'd never heard from her before. Small and involuntary, like the sound a person makes when they've been holding their breath for 6 months, and someone finally tells them they can stop. She moved past him to the crates, and her hands went straight to the top layer with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "These are the original surveys," she said. Her voice was tight with something she was barely keeping controlled. "Caleb, these are the originals, the ones that were supposed to go to the Territorial Archive. He just took them, pulled them out of the transfer, and stored them here where nobody would look." She lifted a document and held it up and turned it toward the light from the open door. "Look at this seal. Look at the date." He came and looked. The seal was stamped in the lower right corner of the survey document, a notary's embossing the kind that left a raised impression in the paper. "Albert Drury," she said. "Crabtree County Notary. Stamp date March 3, 1877. "Drury died in January of 1877, Caleb said. "He was already dead when this was stamped." She set it down and pulled another. "And this one. April 1877. And this one June. He's been stamping documents with a dead man's seal for over a year." Her hands were moving fast through the crates, now reading dates, reading names. "Every fraudulent deed claim in 2 counties. All of it here. All of it provable." Caleb stood at the door and kept his eyes on the clearing, and his ears open to everything behind the silence. His mind was moving fast and not entirely comfortable. "We can't carry all of this," he said. "I know." She didn't stop moving through the files. "I need the key ones, the ones with the fraudulent seal on post-death dates. 6-8 documents. Enough to establish the pattern for a federal judge." "How long?" "Give me 10 minutes." He didn't have 10 minutes to give her, and they both knew it, but he said 8. "Then we move." She worked, and he watched, and 6 minutes in the sound he'd been expecting and dreading came from the South Trail hoofbeats. More than 2 horses, moving at a pace that meant purpose, not coincidence. "Eliza." "I heard them." She was already bundling papers together, folding them tight against her body, tucking them inside her coat. "I've got what I need. Go, now. I'm right behind you." She went out the door and he pulled it shut behind them, not locked. The hasp was ruined but closed, and they were back in the tree line before the riders broke into the clearing. Caleb pressed behind a pine and pulled Eliza down beside him, and they didn't breathe. 3 riders. He counted them through the timber. 3 men, and the one in front was the wide-shouldered deputy from Millhaven, and behind him were 2 men Caleb didn't recognize, but whose posture he read immediately hired men, the kind who were paid to handle problems that couldn't be handled legally. The deputy pulled up in front of the mining shed and looked at the door and went still. He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. The hasp was wrong. The door was sitting at an angle it hadn't been sitting at an hour ago. "Someone's been in there," the deputy said. One of the hired men dropped off his horse and went to the door and pushed it open and went inside. A long pause. Then he came back out. "Files are disturbed. Some of them are gone." The deputy turned his horse in a slow circle, scanning the tree line with the methodical attention of a man who knew tracking. Caleb pressed himself flatter against the pine and put one hand on Eliza's arm and felt her hold herself completely still. The deputy's eyes swept the timber, swept past them, came back, stopped. Caleb's hand closed on his revolver. Then a bird launched out of the brush 20 yards to the left, a big grouse thundering up with that explosive wing beat that made every man in the mountains flinch, and the deputy's eyes snapped to it, and away from the spot where Caleb and Eliza weren't breathing. "Check the north trail," the deputy said. "Somebody was here in the last hour. They can't be far." The 2 hired men rode north. The deputy stayed dismounted and started reading the ground around the shed door, moving slow, building a picture from the dirt and the crushed grass that Caleb knew was good tracking and would eventually lead him to exactly the right tree line. Caleb leaned close to Eliza's ear and said nothing. He just tilted his head west toward the horses, and she understood. They moved. Not fast, fast made noise. They moved the way water moves around a rock, finding the path that made the least disruption. Keeping the timber between themselves and the clearing, sliding from cover to cover, while the deputy worked his way slowly, methodically toward the tree line. It took them 6 minutes to reach the horses. It felt like 6 hours. Caleb untied both animals and handed Eliza her reins, and they led them further west, still on foot, staying quiet, until the ground dropped into a dry creek bed that would mask the sound of hooves on stone. And then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both swung up into the saddles and moved. Not a run. Not yet. A controlled, rapid walk that would leave no sound trail worth following, cutting west and then north through the creek bed for half a mile before coming up onto the high trail that angled back toward Caleb's ranch through country that a man who didn't know these mountains couldn't follow without getting lost. They rode for 20 minutes before either of them spoke. It was Eliza who broke the silence, and her voice was completely steady, which was impressive considering what the last half hour had been. They knew we were going there. Yes. The only people who knew about those documents were Pell and us. Caleb said nothing. She worked it through on her own. They went to Pell again last night. After the boy left with the message, they were watching the house, and they saw the boy leave, and they went back. Her jaw tightened. They made Pell tell them. Most likely. Which means Pell is in danger. Pell's already in danger, Caleb said. Has been for 2 years. This is just more of the same. He looked at her. The question is whether they got enough from him to know where we're going next. She thought about that. I never told Pell about Aldridge. I only told him we needed the documents. He doesn't know about Helena. Then we have a window. A small one. Small is enough. He pressed his horse to a faster walk. We go back to the ranch. We get what we need. Then we ride for Helena. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Caleb. What? The papers under my coat. If we're stopped. We won't be stopped, he said. But if we are. He reached over without looking at her and put his hand briefly on the side of her horse's neck. Not her, just the horse. A steadying gesture. And then took his hand back. If we're stopped, he said, you ride. Whatever direction is open, you ride and you don't stop. I'll handle what needs handling. I won't leave you. Eliza. He said her name with a weight that ended the sentence for her. Those documents are 8 families. They're your father. They're every person Hale has already taken from, and every person he's planning to take from next. He looked at her straight. If it comes to it, the papers matter more than either of us. Ride. She held his gaze for a long moment. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were angry not at him, not exactly, but at the particular injustice of a situation where that kind of choice was even on the table. Then she said, Don't make it come to that. That's my plan, he said. They made it back to the ranch by late afternoon without being followed. Caleb checked twice, doubling back on the high trail, sitting still in the timber, watching their back trail for 15 minutes before coming in. Nothing. Either the deputy had lost them in the creek bed or had gone back to report before pursuing, and either way, it gave them time they needed to use correctly. At the ranch, Caleb went to the house and came out with a canvas satchel and 2 sets of saddlebags, and his second rifle, a shorter carbine, easier for a mounted rider. He didn't go inside more than twice. He didn't look at Clara's things. He packed what a man needed for a hard 3-day ride, and he did it in 10 minutes. Eliza transferred the documents from inside her coat to the canvas satchel with careful hands, organizing them as she went, putting the most critical ones, the ones with the post-death seal dates on top, and wrapped in an extra shirt for protection. What about the ranch? She said. What about it? If we're gone for 3 days, the cattle have the south pasture and the creek hasn't run dry yet. He cinched the saddlebag. The ranch has made it through worse than 3 days without me. She looked at the house, at the kitchen window with its ordinary late afternoon light. What if Hale sends someone while we're gone? Caleb looked at the house too. He thought about Clara's kitchen, about the bread smell on the first night. about a fire in a cold chimney, and how much had changed because of it. "Then he sends someone," he said. "Buildings can be rebuilt. Land can be reclaimed. Dead men can't be unkilled." He picked up the carbine. "Let's go." They were an hour north of the ranch, already into the high timber, when Eliza pulled up and said, "Stop." He stopped. His hand was on the revolver before he could think about it. She wasn't looking at the trail. She was looking at him. "Tell me why you're doing this," she said. "The real reason. Not the land, not the 8 families. You." Her voice was careful, not accusatory. "A month ago, you were a man who hadn't lit his own fire in almost a year. Now you're riding to Helena with stolen documents and a deputy tracking you through the mountains." She paused. "I need to understand why." Caleb sat his horse and looked at the trail ahead for a moment. Then he said, "Clara used to say that grief was a place a person could live in too long." He stopped. He wasn't a man who talked easily about this, and his throat knew it, making the words come out slower than he intended. "I've been living there too long," he said. "And I don't think she'd have much patience for that." He looked at Eliza finally. "She'd have been doing exactly what you're doing, probably faster, and she would have dragged me into it by the ear if I'd been slow enough to need dragging." A pause. "I reckon I'm just starting to catch up to where she'd have wanted me to be." Eliza looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and quiet. "She sounds like someone worth grieving," she said. "She was the best person I've ever known," he said. "That's just the truth of it." Eliza nodded once, like that was enough, said, and she turned Juniper back toward the trail. And then everything changed. A shot cracked from the timber to their east, and it took a chunk of bark off the pine 2 feet above Caleb's head, and both horses exploded forward with the pure animal terror of a sound that close, and Caleb let his horse run, because a moving target in timber was a harder problem than a standing one. He heard Eliza's horse ahead of him, and then beside him, and they were moving fast through the trees, ducking branches, and he could hear one set of hoofbeats behind them, just one, which meant a single shooter, which meant either this was a warning, or whoever it was, had ridden out alone and was now regretting it. Warning. That shot was too high and too clean to be a miss from close range. That was a message. He pulled up behind a rock formation big enough to matter, and Eliza came in tight beside him, and both horses were blowing hard. He checked her first hand's face body, looking for blood. None. "Are you hit?" he said. "No." Her voice was tight but controlled. "You." "No." He came off the horse and moved to the edge of the rocks and listened. The hoofbeats behind them had stopped. No sound of pursuit. He looked back through the trees at the direction of the shot. "One man," he said. He stopped. Why would he stop? And then he saw it or didn't see it. Which was the point? The rider who'd fired wasn't wearing the clothes of a hired gun. A flash of gray coat between the pines, a horse that moved reluctantly like its rider was having second thoughts. Gray coat. Millhaven. He'd seen that coat at a table in a saloon. "It's the sheriff," Caleb said. Eliza stared at him. "What?" "The shot was high," he said. "A warning. He followed us out of town, and he fired high." He watched the distant movement of the gray coat through the trees, getting further away, retreating. He let us hear him coming, and then he fired wide on purpose. "That makes no sense." "Yes, it does." Caleb looked at her. "He told us to leave town. We left. He knows what we're doing. He knows we have the documents." He felt something clarify in his chest, not warmth, not trust, but something adjacent. The recognition of a man caught between 2 bad choices, who'd made the least bad one. He's not going to stop us. He's going to let us get clear, and then he's going to report that he lost us in the timber. Eliza stared back through the trees at the diminishing shape of the gray coat. "He's afraid," she said. "He's ashamed," Caleb said. "There's a difference." He put his foot back in the stirrup. "Come on. If he's giving us cover, we'd better use it." She mounted without another word, and they pushed north harder, now trading caution for speed because the sheriff's warning had also been a clock. Hale would know they were out of reach soon, and when he knew that he would start making moves that didn't involve men on horses in the timber. He would start making legal moves the way he always did, and that was the kind of fight that had to be won before it started. The sky was going dark at the edges when Caleb said, "We ride through the night." Eliza said, "I know. You don't have to." "I know the way to Helena," she said. "My father rode it with me when I was 12 years old. I know every relay station and every water point." She looked at him sidelong. "Keep up." He almost smiled. Almost. They rode north into the gathering dark, two shapes on a mountain trail, with a satchel full of proof between them and behind them. Somewhere in the summer night, a corrupt land sat waiting to be taken apart, piece by piece, and ahead of them was a city and a lawyer and a federal judge, and the long, difficult, uncertain road to making something right that had been made very wrong. And Caleb Boone, who had not lit his own fire in 11 months, who had been living in grief, like a man living in a room with all the windows painted black, felt the night air on his face, and the mountain moving under his horse, and the particular terrifying feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't know how it would end, but he knew he wasn't turning around. They rode through the night without stopping, except to water the horses at a creek crossing. Eliza found in the dark by memory alone. And when the first gray light of morning came up over the eastern peaks, Helena was visible below them in the valley, like something laid out on a table, bigger than Millhaven. Noisier with the particular sprawl of a territorial capital that had grown faster than anyone planned for. Caleb hadn't slept. He didn't think Eliza had either, though she'd gone quiet somewhere after midnight, in the way that wasn't sleep, but was the thing a person did when they needed to go inside themselves and hold something together. He hadn't pushed conversation. He'd just ridden beside her and watched the trail and let the night do what nights did. Now coming down out of the timber into the valley road, she straightened in the saddle and said, "Aldridge keeps an office on the north end of the Capitol building block, second floor above the surveyor's office." She paused. "He won't know us." "That's fine," Caleb said. "He might not see us without an appointment." "That's less fine." He looked at her. "Can you get him to open the door?" "Give me 30 seconds with him," she said. "I can get him to open the door." He believed her. He'd believed her about most things by this point, which was a change from the first night when he'd had a rifle pointed at her on his own kitchen floor. He thought about that and found the distance between that moment and this one almost impossible to measure. Not in miles. In something else entirely. Helena's main streets were already moving when they came through freight wagons, men on horses, the business of a capital city, conducting itself without regard for what any individual person needed. Caleb kept his hat low and his eyes moving. He looked for gray coats, looked for the 2 clean horses of hired men, looked for anyone whose attention moved to them and stayed. Nobody seemed to notice them. That was either good or a different kind of bad. They tied the horses at a rail 2 blocks from the Capitol building, and Caleb took the canvas satchel off the saddle and carried it himself, one hand on the strap, the other hand free. They walked without hurrying. They looked like 2 people who belonged where they were going, which was the best disguise available. The door above the surveyor's office had a frosted glass panel with R. Aldridge, Attorney at Law, lettered in black. Eliza knocked without hesitating. A long pause. Then footsteps. The door opened 6 inches, and a man looked out at them, late 40s, sharp-eyed behind wire spectacles, a pen still in his hand, like he'd been pulled away from something mid-sentence. "We're not open for walk-ins," he said. "Albert Drury's notary seal," Eliza said. "Used to authenticate 14 property transfers across 2 counties after Drury died in January of 1877. I have the original documents, and I have a diagram of where they were stored, and the name of the federal clerk who can verify the death date." The door opened all the way. Richard Aldridge looked at her for a moment, then at Caleb, then at the canvas satchel. "Come in," he said, "and close the door behind you." He was good. Caleb had expected a city lawyer's smooth surface, careful eyes that calculated fee structures while pretending to listen. Aldridge wasn't that. He spread the documents across his desk and read without speaking for 12 straight minutes. And in those 12 minutes, Caleb watched the man's face move through 3 distinct expressions: skepticism, then recognition, then something that looked almost like hunger. The particular hunger of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing to arrive. "Victor Hale," Aldridge said, not looking up. "Yes," Eliza said. "I had a case against one of his associates 3 years ago. Filed land fraud charges in the territorial court." He turned a document over and looked at the seal date. The case was dismissed. Evidence was ruled inadmissible on a procedural technicality that I still believe was manufactured. He set the document down. "I have never been able to prove that." "You won't need to prove that," Eliza said. "This is bigger than that case. This goes to the federal level." "It does," he said. "If these documents are genuine." He looked at her directly. "How did you obtain them?" Eliza looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "They were stored in a structure on Hale's mining claims south of Crabtree Pass. The structure wasn't secure." Aldridge held his gaze for a moment, reading the specific, careful language Caleb had used. "The structure wasn't secure," he repeated. "No, sir," Caleb said. "It wasn't." Another moment. Then Aldridge picked up his pen. "I'm going to need affidavits from both of you. Detailed accounts of how the documents came to be in your possession, the chain of custody from the original county recording office, and the name of every person who can corroborate the seal fraud." He was already writing. "I'm also going to need Josiah Pell." "Pell is frightened," Eliza said. "Hale's been holding his son's debt over him for 2 years. If I can get the debt settled—" "We discussed that," Caleb said. $400. Aldridge looked up at him. A measuring look. "You'd do that." "Already planned to." Caleb set the satchel on the desk. "How fast can you get this in front of the circuit judge?" "Judge Harlan Morse is sitting session in Helena through the end of the week." Aldridge pulled out a pocket watch. "It is currently 8:43 in the morning." He looked at them both. "If you can write your affidavits in the next 2 hours, and I can have my clerk verify the death certificate record for Albert Drury, by noon I can have a filing in front of Morse by 2 o'clock this afternoon." Caleb felt something move through the room like a current. "This afternoon," Eliza said. "This afternoon," Aldridge confirmed. "Victor Hale's reach is long, but it does not extend to Harlan Morse. Morse is 61 years old and has held federal bench for 20 years, and does not like being told what to do by land speculators, regardless of how much money they have." He paused. "But I need to be very clear with you both. Filing today means Hale will know by tonight. His people will have contacts in the clerk's office. I can't prevent that. Once this is filed, you are no longer walking carefully around the edge of something dangerous." He set down his pen and looked at them straight. "You are standing in the middle of it." Silence in the office. Eliza said, "We were already in the middle of it." "File it," Caleb said. Aldridge nodded once and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. They wrote their affidavits at a table in the corner of the office, while Aldridge's clerk, a young man who moved with the quick, purposeful energy of someone who knew the value of time, disappeared to the county records hall to pull the death certificate. Caleb wrote his in plain, factual language, the way a man described what his hands had done and what his eyes had seen without embellishment. Eliza wrote hers in the careful, precise language of a woman who had grown up in a county recorder's office and knew exactly what a legal document needed to carry weight. They were done in 90 minutes. Aldridge read both affidavits, made 3 small corrections for legal precision, and handed them to the clerk. And then they waited. Caleb went to the window that faced the street and stood where he could see the road without being seen from it, and Eliza sat across the room with her hands folded in her lap, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that actions weren't already saying. At 11:40, The clerk came back with the death certificate. Albert Drury, Crabtree County. Died January 14, 1877. The earliest fraudulent seal date in Eliza's documents was March 3, 1877. 7 weeks after a dead man's hand had supposedly authenticated a property transfer. Aldridge held the death certificate and the fraudulent document side by side and said quietly, "There it is." And that was when the door opened. Not a knock. The door simply opened and a man walked in, and Caleb had his revolver out before the man had taken 2 steps inside, and the man stopped immediately and raised both hands with the careful, unhurried movement of someone who had expected this reaction. He was older. 60s, maybe. Suit that was good but not showy. Silver badge on his chest. Not local law. Federal. "My name is Marshal Robert Creed," the man said, looking at Caleb's revolver with the patience of someone who'd had guns pointed at him before and had stopped finding it remarkable. "I'm out of the Denver Circuit office. I'd appreciate it if you'd lower that." Caleb did not lower it. "How'd you know we were here?" "I've had a man watching Aldridge's office for 3 weeks, Creed said, "waiting for someone to walk in with exactly what you're carrying." He looked at the canvas satchel on Aldridge's desk. "I've been building a case against Victor Hale for 8 months. I hit the same wall every time the original documents. Without the originals, everything I had was circumstantial." He looked at Caleb directly. "I believe you have the originals." Caleb looked at Aldridge. Aldridge said carefully, "I know Creed's name. He's legitimate. He's also not the marshal I told you was in Hale's pocket. That's the district marshal in Crabtree County. Creed is Federal Circuit. Different chain of command entirely." Caleb held the revolver level for one more moment. Reading Creed's face, reading his hands, reading the specific quality of patience in a man who was telling the truth and knew he had time to let it be verified. He lowered the revolver. Creed put his hands down. "Thank you." He looked at Eliza. "Miss Rowan, I know your father. I spoke to Thomas Rowan 4 months ago in Millhaven. He told me his daughter would be the one to find the proof if it existed." A pause. He was right. Eliza's breath caught, just for a moment, barely visible, the kind of thing only a person watching closely would notice. Caleb noticed. "My father knew you were investigating," she said. "He came to me," Creed said. "Walked into the federal office in Millhaven on his own. Told me everything he knew. But without the documents, there was nothing I could do that Hale's lawyers wouldn't dismantle in a day." He moved to Aldridge's desk and looked at the spread of documents without touching them. "Now I have the documents and a filing before Morse this afternoon and an 8-month investigation that just found the piece it was missing." The room was very quiet for a moment. Eliza said, "My father never told me." "He didn't want you involved," Creed said. "He was trying to protect you." "He didn't do a very good job," she said. "No," Creed said, "but you did." She looked at the documents on the desk, the proof she'd ridden 4 days to find broken into a locked shed to retrieve carried under her coat through timber while a deputy tracked them and transported through the night to a federal lawyer's office. Her jaw was set in that way Caleb had come to recognize, the way she held things together when they wanted to come apart. Then she said, "What happens now?" Creed and Aldridge exchanged a look. "Now," Aldridge said, "you both need to not be visible in Helena for the next few hours." Creed's investigation adds weight to this filing, significant weight, but it also means when this hits Morse's desk this afternoon, Hale will know by this evening that it's not just a land fraud complaint. It's a federal investigation with 8 months of background. He looked at Caleb. "He will react." "How?" Caleb said. "Hale doesn't use guns," Creed said, "but the men he employs do. And a man facing the end of a 2-county land scheme that's been running for 3 years will make different calculations than a man who thinks he still has options." He held Caleb's gaze. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," Caleb said. "There's a boarding house on the west side of the Capital District, Mrs. Hatch runs it. She's known to me. She's trustworthy. She won't ask questions I haven't already answered for her." Creed wrote the address on a card and handed it to Caleb. "Go there. Stay inside. I will come to you when the filing is confirmed." Caleb took the card and looked at it, and then looked at Eliza. She was still looking at the documents. "Eliza," he said. She looked up. "Let's go," he said. She nodded and turned away from the papers that had cost 6 months of her life, and a 4-day mountain ride, and one very cold night in a church. And she followed Caleb out of Aldridge's office and down the stairs and into the Helena Street. They walked to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house without talking, and the city moved around them with its indifferent ordinary business, and nobody looked at them twice. And Caleb thought about how strange it was that the most significant thing he'd ever done in his life had happened in a small upstairs office that nobody on this street knew existed. Mrs. Hatch was a compact woman in her 60s, with the kind of face that had decided long ago not to be surprised by anything. She showed them 2 rooms without comment, and brought coffee without being asked, and left them alone, which was exactly the right thing to do. In the narrow hallway between their rooms, Eliza stopped. "He was trying to protect me," she said. "My father." "I know." "He walked into a federal office alone without telling me because he didn't want me riding into something dangerous." She looked at the floor for a moment. "And then I rode into it anyway." "That's what families do," Caleb said. "They try to keep each other out of the hard things. Doesn't usually work." She looked up at him. "You don't have family." It wasn't cruel. It was just the careful observation of someone who paid attention. "Not anymore," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, there was something that hadn't been between them before. Not exactly comfort and not exactly understanding, but something in the neighborhood of both the kind of thing that built up slowly between people who'd ridden hard through difficult country together and hadn't let each other down. "Your wife would be proud of what you did," she said, "riding out, helping when you didn't have to." Caleb looked at the wall for a moment. "She'd say I took long enough." The corner of Eliza's mouth moved, almost a smile. He was getting used to the almost smiles that were more honest than full ones because they were too quick to be performed. "Get some rest," he said. "We may need to move fast tonight." She went into her room, and he went into his, and he lay down on the narrow bed with his boots on, and his revolver on the table where he could reach it in the dark, and he stared at the ceiling and waited for something to happen, which was always the worst part. It happened at 4 in the afternoon. Not Creed's knock. A different sound, voices below, urgent, and then Mrs. Hatch's footsteps on the stairs faster than her usual pace, and a sharp knock on Caleb's door. He had the revolver in his hand before he crossed the room. He opened the door. Mrs. Hatch looked at the gun without reacting. "Man downstairs says he's from Aldridge's office. Young man, he looks scared." Caleb looked past her to Eliza's door, which was already open. She'd heard. "Send him up," Caleb said. It was Aldridge's clerk. He was out of breath, and his collar was wrong, like he'd been moving fast and hadn't stopped to straighten himself. And when he looked at Caleb and Eliza, his face had the particular expression of someone carrying news that was both good and terrible at the same time. "The filing went through," he said. "Judge Morse accepted it. He's ordered an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning at 9. He swallowed. "That's the good part." "What's the bad part?" Eliza said. "Hale knows." The clerk looked between them. "Mr. Aldridge says he got word 20 minutes ago. Hale rode into Helena an hour ago with 3 men and his personal lawyer. He went straight to the territorial governor's office." He paused. "He's not running, he's fighting." Caleb felt it not fear, but the recalibration of a man adjusting his understanding of the distance between himself and the end of something. "What can he do?" Eliza said. "The filing is already in front of Morse. His lawyer is arguing that the documents were illegally obtained," the clerk said. He looked at Caleb with an apology in his eyes. "He's filing a counter-motion to have the evidence ruled inadmissible. Same argument that killed the case 3 years ago." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "Mr. Aldridge sent this for you." Caleb opened it. One sheet. Aldridge's handwriting fast but legible. "The counter motion has merit. The manner of document retrieval can be argued. I need Pell in this courtroom tomorrow." With Pell's testimony and the death certificate, the document origin becomes secondary. The fraud is established through a living witness. Without Pell, Hale's lawyer may win the motion. Creed is riding for Millhaven tonight. He needs 12 hours. The hearing is at 9. Caleb read it once. Then again. Then he handed it to Eliza. She read it, and her face went very still. "Pell," she said. "Pell," he said. She looked at him. "Creed is riding for him. There's nothing more we can do tonight." "No," he said. "Hale's men will try to stop Creed before he reaches Pell." "Yes." She handed the letter back and looked at the window and the city outside it, and the particular quality of afternoon light that had maybe 4 hours left in it before dark, and Caleb watched her think it through and reach the same conclusion he'd already reached, because they were both people who looked at hard facts without flinching, and that was something. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said. 9 o'clock, he said. And everything depends on whether an old man in Millhaven is brave enough to get on a horse tonight. Caleb thought about Josiah Pell. About 15 years of careful record-keeping hidden in the back of a frightened man's house. About a boy on a mountain trail with shaking hands and his grandfather's message. About the specific kind of courage that wasn't loud and wasn't fast, but was the kind that held on in the dark for 15 years just in case the day came when it mattered. "He's brave enough," Caleb said. "He's been brave enough the whole time. He just needed someone to open the door." Eliza looked at him then, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen from her before. Not the set jaw and the controlled exterior, but something underneath that. Something that had been there the whole time, holding all the rest of it up. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door." He understood she wasn't only talking about Pell. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said what he knew to be true. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be the hardest day of all of this." She nodded and went back to her room, and Caleb sat in the chair by his window with the revolver on his knee and watched the Helena Street go from afternoon to evening, and somewhere out there on a mountain road in the dark, a federal marshal was riding hard toward a frightened old man who was either going to find his courage or lose it, and the whole thing, the 8 families, the forged seals, the 2 years of stolen land, the courtroom tomorrow at 9, all of it balanced on that single question. Caleb sat and watched the dark, and did not sleep, and the night was long, and the morning was coming, and he was ready. The knock came at 5:43 in the morning. Caleb was already awake, he'd never stopped being awake, and he had the revolver up before the second knock landed. He crossed to the door in the dark and said, "Who?" "Creed." He opened it. The marshal looked like a man who had ridden through the night and wasn't pretending otherwise. Dust on his coat, dark circles under his eyes, and the particular tight energy of someone running on nothing but necessity, and the knowledge that stopping wasn't an option yet. Behind him in the hallway stood Josiah Pell. He was older than Caleb had pictured him, mid-60s, small-framed with the careful posture of a man who'd spent decades bending over record books. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from something that lived deeper than cold. Eliza's door opened. She'd heard. She took one look at Pell standing in the hallway, and something moved across her face so fast Caleb almost missed it. Relief and gratitude, and the particular emotion that had no clean name. The one that came when a thing you'd stopped letting yourself hope for actually happened. She crossed the hallway and took both of Pell's shaking hands in hers and said, "Thank you, Josiah." The old man looked at her, and his jaw worked for a moment before sound came out. "Your father was good to me for 15 years, he said. "I should have done this 2 years ago. I'm sorry I didn't." "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Creed looked at Caleb over their heads. "Hale's lawyer filed his counter-motion at 6 o'clock last evening. Morse reviewed it, and he hasn't ruled yet. The hearing is at 9. We have 3 hours, and Pell needs to be prepped by Aldridge before he takes the stand." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded telegram. This came through the Denver office at midnight. Caleb took it and read it. 4 lines. Federal Circuit confirmation that Albert Drury's death had been recorded in the Territorial Archive on January 19, 1877. Official date of death, January 14th. The confirmation bore the seal of the Denver Federal Records Office. Caleb handed it to Eliza without a word. She read it. Then she looked up at Creed. This closes the gap completely. It closes it so tight there's no room left for argument, Creed said. Hale's lawyer can challenge the document retrieval all he wants. Pell's testimony establishes the fraud from a living witness. The Denver confirmation establishes the death date from a federal record. The counter-motion dies in Morse's hands before it gets started. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it. But Hale won't know that until he's already in the courtroom and it's too late to walk out. Caleb said, "He'll have something else." "He always does," Creed said. "That's why we don't give him time to deploy it." He looked at all 3 of them. "We move in 20 minutes. They moved in 18. Aldridge met them in his office at 6:30, with coffee he'd clearly made himself, and a legal pad covered in handwriting that went to the edges of every margin. He sat Pell down across from him, and for the next 2 hours, he walked the old man through exactly what would be asked, exactly how to answer, and exactly where to stop talking. Caleb watched Pell's hands stop shaking somewhere in the first 30 minutes. Not because the fear went away. Because purpose settled over him like a coat, and a man with a purpose to hold on to stopped noticing what his hands were doing. Eliza sat beside Caleb on the bench along the wall, and they didn't speak because there was nothing useful left to say, and both of them understood that. At one point, she said quietly, "Whatever happens in there, it's going to go right," Caleb said. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know we did everything that could be done, and we did it right. Whatever Morse decides after that isn't ours to carry." He looked at her straight. "You did everything, Eliza. Every piece of this." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away at the wall. "We did it," she said. He didn't argue. At 8:45 they walked into the federal courthouse. The building was larger than anything in Millhaven or Crabtree Pass stone, 2 stories with the particular weight of an institution that intended to last. The courtroom on the 2nd floor was already half full when they arrived, and Caleb felt the room before he read the faces in it. Tension had a texture. This room had it in layers. Victor Hale was already there. He was seated at the defense table with 2 men in suits Caleb recognized as lawyers by the specific way they arranged their papers, precise, ritualistic, the confidence of men who believed the arrangement of documents could control outcomes. Hale himself sat with his hands folded and his back straight and his face carrying the same pleasant, patient expression he'd worn in Caleb's yard the day he'd come to offer a fair price for land that wasn't his to buy. He looked at Caleb when they entered. He looked at the canvas satchel. Something moved behind his eyes too fast to be read, too controlled to be identified. Then he looked away. His lawyer was on his feet the moment Aldridge entered. "Your Honor, we renew our objection to the admissibility of documents obtained through Mr. Thorne." Judge Harlan Morse's voice came from the bench with the flat authority of a man who had not needed to raise it in 20 years. He was exactly as Aldridge had described 61 heavy-set, with the face of someone who found most legal theatrics mildly offensive. "I have read your motion. I will address it in the appropriate sequence. Sit down." Thorne sat down. Morse looked at the room over his spectacles. "This is an evidentiary hearing, not a trial. I am here to determine whether sufficient cause exists to proceed to full federal prosecution." He looked at his papers. "Mr. Aldridge, you may begin." Aldridge stood. He was precise, and he was fast. Caleb had expected the methodical pace of a man building an argument, but Aldridge moved through his opening like a man who knew he had more evidence than time and had chosen to lead with the thing that mattered most. "Your Honor, I am presenting 3 independent and mutually corroborating bodies of evidence. first original survey documents bearing the notary seal of Albert Drury at dates subsequent to Drury's documented death. Second federal confirmation of Drury's death date from the Denver Circuit Records Office. Third, sworn testimony from a 15-year employee of the Crabtree County Recorder's Office, who will establish the chain of custody for every document in question. He paused. Any one of these three standing alone raises serious questions. Together, they establish beyond reasonable argument that Victor Hale's land acquisition scheme was built on systematic document fraud across a period of more than 2 years. Victor Hale's face did not change. His hands still folded on the table, pressed slightly flatter. Caleb saw it. He was watching for it. Thorne was on his feet. Your Honor, the manner in which these alleged documents were obtained is addressed by the witness testimony, Aldridge said without looking at Thorne, which I am about to present. Call your witness, Morse said. Josiah Pell walked to the stand. He was small, and he was old, and his hands were visible from where Caleb sat, and they were no longer shaking. He sat down in the witness chair and looked at Aldridge and waited with the patience of a man who had been waiting 15 years for exactly this moment, and had decided somewhere between Millhaven and Helena in the dark of the previous night that he was done waiting. Aldridge walked him through it slowly. 15 years at the recorder's office, the filing system, the seal registry, how a notary seal was logged and what records were kept of its use, how a transfer document was processed from initial filing through final archive. Then, Mr. Pell, were you present when the survey documents in question were originally filed with the Crabtree County Recorder's Office? I processed them myself, Pell said. Every one. And were those documents to your knowledge transferred to the Territorial Archive as required by county procedure? They were logged for transfer in February of 1878, Pell said. I logged them personally. They were placed in the transfer box. He looked at the documents spread on Aldridge's table. They never arrived at the archive. I checked 3 months later when I was preparing the annual inventory. The archive had no record of receiving them. Did you report this discrepancy? A pause. Pell's jaw tightened. I reported it to my supervisor, who reported it to the county recorder. Another pause. I was told the records had been located and the matter was resolved. Were you given any documentation of that resolution? No. Did you believe the matter was resolved? Pell looked at Aldridge for a moment. Then he looked at Hale, direct, steady, the look of a man paying a debt that was overdue. No, Pell said. I did not. Thorne cross-examined for 20 minutes and got nowhere useful because Pell answered every question with the specific, contained accuracy of a man who had spent 15 years recording facts and knew the difference between what he knew and what he speculated and refused to be pushed from one into the other. When Thorne sat down, he was doing it carefully, like a man trying not to show that his legs were uncertain. Aldridge presented the Denver confirmation. He presented the seal date analysis, a document he'd prepared overnight, showing every fraudulent filing date against the January 14th death date, laid out in a column that was visually devastating in its simplicity. Then Creed took the stand and presented 8 months of federal investigation, financial records, land transaction timelines, the names of every ranching family who had been displaced, and the specific mechanism by which each displacement had been accomplished. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Not the polite quiet of a formal proceeding. The held-breath quiet of a room full of people watching something irreversible happen. Thorne's countermotion that the original documents had been illegally obtained landed in front of Morse at the end of 2 hours of testimony like a stone thrown into a river. It made a sound. It caused a small disturbance. And then it sank. Morse looked at the motion. Looked at the testimony. Looked at the Denver confirmation. The documents, he said, corroborate testimony that stands independently of the documents. The testimony corroborates the documents. The Federal Records Office corroborates both. He set Thorne's motion down. The admissibility challenge is denied. Thorne rose. Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Thorne. Morse's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It didn't need to. I am referring this matter to the federal prosecutor's office for full indictment proceedings. I am also issuing an immediate injunction on all property transfers associated with the Hale Land Company in Crabtree and surrounding counties pending the outcome of prosecution. He looked at Victor Hale over his spectacles. Mr. Hale, you will surrender your travel documents to Marshal Creed before leaving this building. Victor Hale looked at the judge. And for the first time since Caleb had laid eyes on him in his own yard and Caleb's yard in this courtroom, the pleasant patience drained out of his face. What was underneath it was not fury. It was something colder than fury. The expression of a man who had planned for every contingency and had not planned for this one, and who understood in this moment exactly what that meant. He looked at his lawyer. Thorne was looking at his papers, not at Hale. Hale looked at Creed, who was already moving toward the defense table. Then he looked across the courtroom at Eliza Rowan. She met his gaze without moving, without flinching, without giving him a single thing to take with him out of this room. He looked away first. It was a small thing. It was everything. Caleb felt Eliza's hand find his arm, not grabbing, not clinging, just a brief press of her fingers against his sleeve, here and then gone, the way a person touched something to confirm it was real. He didn't move. He let her have it. Outside the courthouse, in the sharp morning heat of a Helena summer, Aldridge shook their hands and said the things a lawyer says when a case goes right, and Creed said he'd be in touch about the prosecution timeline. And Pell stood off to the side with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying too long, and wasn't sure yet how to walk without the weight of it. Eliza went to him. She stood with him for a few minutes talking quietly, and Caleb stayed back, because that was between them and didn't need a third person. He watched the Helena Street move around them, the indifferent ordinary business of a city that didn't know what had happened on the second floor of that building this morning, and wouldn't know until the papers ran it, and maybe not fully even then. 8 families, their land, their futures. He thought about that, about the fact that winning in a courtroom was not the same as undoing what had been done. The ranchers who'd been displaced would have to file their own claims, now navigate the legal process, wait out an injunction period while their land sat idle. It would take time. It would take money some of them didn't have. The law had moved in the right direction this morning, but the law moved slowly, and real people lived at regular speed, and there was always a distance between those two things that didn't fully close. But it was movement. After 11 months of nothing moving at all, he understood the value of that. Eliza came back to him, and her eyes were red at the edges, and she didn't apologize for it, which he was glad of. "He's going home," she said. "Pell. He said he's going to go home and sleep for 3 days." "Good man," Caleb said. "Caleb." She stopped in front of him and looked at him with the directness she'd never once withheld from him, from the very first night when she'd turned around from his stove with a ladle in her hand and refused to be afraid. "My father's in Millhaven. I need to go to him." "I know," he said. "He doesn't know what happened here. He's been sitting in my uncle's house for 6 months not knowing." She looked at the courthouse door. "I need to be the one to tell him." "Then go tell him." She looked at Caleb, and there was something in her expression that was complicated and clear, at the same time, the specific expression of a person standing at the place where one thing ended and another thing hadn't started yet, and both of those facts were true simultaneously. "The ranch," she said. "What about it?" "I left it in better shape than I found it," she said. "The south fence is solid. The pump works. The cattle have water." A pause. "You'll manage." "I've managed before," he said. "You have." She held his gaze. "Badly." He almost smiled. He was getting better at those too. "I'll manage better this time," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "When my father is settled, when the injunction clears and his land is filed for return, when I know he's all right." She stopped. She was choosing her words with the care of someone who understood that some words once said changed the architecture of things. I'd like to come back and see how the south fence is holding up. The summer heat pressed down on the Helena Street, and somewhere behind them, the courthouse door opened and voices spilled out, and the city moved and breathed around them, and Caleb Boone stood on that dusty street and looked at Eliza Rowan, and felt the particular terrifying clarity of a man who had been in the dark for a long time and was no longer pretending the light wasn't there. "The south fence will need checking," he said. "Come when you're ready." She nodded once. The almost smile came, and this time it stayed a fraction longer than usual. Then she went to Juniper, tied at the rail, and she swung up into the saddle with the ease of a woman born to it, and she looked down at him one last time with those steady dark eyes. "Take care of yourself, Caleb Boone," she said. "You too, Eliza Rowan," he said. She turned the mare north, and she rode, and he watched her go until the street curved and she was out of sight. He stood there for a moment, just standing, letting the moment be what it was without pushing it into something else. Then he went and got his horse, and he rode south back toward the mountains, back toward the spread that had been empty for too long, back toward a kitchen that smelled like someone had cooked in it recently, and a fence line that was solid, and a pump that worked, and a fire that would need lighting when the evening came down cold off the peaks. It was a 3-hour ride. He took it steady. At the top of the last mountain grade before the ranch came into view, he stopped the horse without planning to. Just stopped. And he sat there and looked at the valley below, at the thin line of smoke that wasn't there, that was just the late summer haze off the dry grass. And he thought about a chimney that had been cold for 11 months, and what it had meant when it wasn't cold anymore. He thought about Clara. He did this without flinching, which was different from before. He thought about her laugh, and her sharp mind, and the way she'd faced hard things without theatrics. And he thought about what she'd said, about grief being a place a person could live in too long. And he thought about how right she'd been, and how long he'd proved her right by staying there. He was done staying there. He pressed his heels to the horse and rode down into the valley, and when he got to the ranch, he unsaddled and watered the animal and walked the south fence line because it was late afternoon, and that was what you did. And it held solid all the way to the eastern corner, every post set clean, the wire taut the way it was supposed to be. He stood at the eastern corner of the fence and looked at the land, his land, still his. Because a woman had ridden 4 days to find the proof that kept it that way, and an old man had found his courage in the dark, and a marshal had ridden through the night, and a judge had looked at the truth and called it what it was. He walked back to the house and he went inside. He built a fire. Not because the summer night was cold, because a fire in the hearth meant someone lived there, because a dark house was a house waiting to be grieved over, and he was done grieving over things that were still standing. He cooked a simple meal and ate it at the kitchen table, and did not look at the chair across from him as an absence. He looked at it as a chair. When the meal was done, he washed the dishes and set them to dry, and went to the window and looked out at the mountain dark and the stars coming out hard and white above the peaks. The same stars that had been up there last June and the June before that, and every June a man could remember. He thought about Eliza riding north to her father, about the look on Pell's face when he'd finished testifying, about the sheriff in the gray coat who'd fired high in the timber and ridden away, and what it had cost a frightened man to make the least bad choice available to him. He thought about 8 families who would start getting letters from federal lawyers in the coming weeks, letters that said something had changed, letters that said the land wasn't gone after all. He thought about all of it, and then he stopped thinking about it, because a man who lived only in what had just happened was no different from a man who lived only in what had already ended, and he'd spent enough time in both of those places to know they were the same country with different weather. He turned from the window. He left the lamp burning on the kitchen table, not low, not hidden, but burning steady and warm, sending its light out through the glass into the mountain dark. Because some things once broken didn't go back to being what they were. They became something else, something that had been tested and held and knew now exactly what it was made of. Caleb Boone went to bed in a house that was not empty, and the light stayed on all night.